educator, as a social science, and as an evaluator are really complementary skill sets. And I feel that all of those three are things that I use every day. I work for myself now as a consultant with Colorado Evaluation and Research Consulting, and I work with my husband there. In terms of includes, I am one of 2 external evaluators for the CAHSI, the Computing Alliance for Hispanic Serving Institutions, Includes Alliance. I work with Heather Theory on that project, and I've been working with CAHSI since 2007. I'm going to see who's in the chat here. Anybody put their name? Liz Litzer, hi Liz, from the Aspire Alliance. Who else? Anybody else? Leah Martinez from ACS Bridge Program and iGen. Thank you, Leah. Lucas Hill from Aspire. Hi, Lucas. Ken Rath from 50K Plus. Asli Abdi Noor from Aspire as well. And Rebecca Zarch, hello. Engineering Plus Alliance, a new alliance. Nice to meet you. Thanks, everyone. So I want to, Lucia Arellano, a newbie from All Rise Alliance, coming from Texas Tech. Hello, Lucy. I'll try to monitor that, make sure I don't miss anybody. I wanted to get a sense of who is in the room, right? We're coming at data from the perspective of getting others to talk about and think about data together and maybe be a little critical of the data and interpretive with data. So it's important for me to get a sense of who's in the room. A lot of this presentation has an assumption that you might have an evaluative role, but I want to get a sense if I need to kind of shift a little bit more towards the side of program coordinators to the side of PI. I want to make sure that I'm doing that. So I'm going to launch a poll here. Hi, Cody Williams from Western Michigan, working with iBears. Tell me if you can see this. I see somebody push something. Thank you. So yeah, getting a sense of who you are in the room. I see evaluator, a little bit of PI, program coordinator, and visitor. Okay, great. So we're definitely heavy on evaluation, which is sort of what I assumed, which is helpful. But it's helpful to think about the PI role as well when we're talking, and program coordinator, and that potential grantee. And other. I always like another. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for letting me know about that. So I confess, when I wrote these goals, I did not know that I had 1 hour. I was thinking, wow, what would I do? These are all the things I want to do. So they are a bit lofty for a 1 hour session. So I want to really focus on the ones that are in bold in particular, which are the consider why you might support group interpretation of data. Begin to develop your own plan for data digs with clients. And consider how interpretation of findings may increase accountability or buy-in from participants. I also want to say we have Serena from Capital Technology University in Maryland, who's a grant writer. Thank you. So I want to start by just asking you all your thoughts on why we might want to include stakeholders in meeting-making activities. Just a bit of a brainstorm at this point. Anybody have anything they want to say verbally or in the chat about why that might be an important thing to do? Maybe particularly in includes? I have ideas. I just thought I'd start with yours.
Sometimes, hi everyone, this is Liz from Aspire, and I think sometimes there's a usefulness around sort of double checking your findings, triangulation, if you will, to make sure that what you found really is resonating with people. That's one thought that I have.
Great idea. Yeah, I think definitely that double checking, and this is what we're noticing. Does that ring true for you? Is important. I see Rebecca's writing. People should own their stories. I think that's really important. That idea of owning your story. The diverse lenses might bring to the fore something we might not otherwise see. I think that's a great point too. When we have our own lens as evaluators or as PIs, there's a lot of things we miss, right? I'm going to read. Helps build shared vision. I'm going to scroll up to Leah. Stakeholder buy-in is critical in maintaining continued support. In line with Stephen Covey, seek first to understand, then to be understood. That's a great idea to share in this setting, I think. New message. Data cannot be findings without meaning making among those who collect and use the data. So true. And I think meaning making is a great idea, because we can give you data, we can interpret data, but if you're not using it, or it's hard to make meaning with it, it's not super useful. I'm going to give you a few ideas that I had in my brain regarding purposes for stakeholder engagement. Some examples from my work have been with the needs stakeholder support, making sense of complex data. We had we're gathering enrollment and graduation data on a department in computer science, and all of a sudden they went from like 35 graduates a year to like 4. And people were like, I think we need to figure this out, right? And so we had a conversation with some faculty. We thought, oh, this is a really big problem. We have the retention issue. It turns out that they just changed their iPad's zip code regarding how they're are looking at a computer science department, and it changed the way that the program was reporting. And those 4 were kind of relics of the past program. And then there was a whole new data set that we didn't have because we didn't know to ask for it, because we needed that context to make sense of that data. Another example is we've had issues with, I know none of you have ever seen this, where you have an issue with getting data from clients, from students, from different stakeholders. And we've definitely used the case study of one faculty member or one institution that did a really good job getting students to complete surveys for us, and then digging into that data because we had enough of it to really show why that data might be useful to the faculty member themselves, but also to the group as a whole. So really using that buy-in to kind of to build more engagement with evaluation in the future. Another instance was we had developing summative tools and measures. We had a climate survey data for a department for a RED grant. And we were going over the data together with faculty, and they said, well, those aren't the questions that I care about, right? And so rather than just let that be less useful, we designed a new instrument that did include some of the items that the faculty cared about, so that when they heard the data, it was more resonating with what they wanted to learn than the data that we had in the first go around. So these are just ways that I've incorporated stakeholders in some meaning making. Does anyone want to share anything in particular that they've done that they found useful, or a purpose for that? That's cool. You can talk later. It's fine. We'll have more opportunity. I really think it's important to think about the role of evaluation and the power that can come with evaluation. This quote from Patton really resonated with me when I was developing this presentation, that knowledge is power and evaluation provides knowledge. Evaluation provides power. And so when I'm thinking about sharing data, either as a fully formed idea or as something that is still to be co-constructed, I really think about that power. Like, how can we help share that power of knowledge building with others? And at the same time, getting that contextually relevant knowledge that we need to really make meaning of that data, so that we're not just spitting out a report that nobody reads, but instead we're making meaning together with the information that we're gleaning from evaluation. So I think this is an important thing to consider. Stakeholders will be differently prepared to participate in data conversations. When they're fueled by the need to know, like it includes with data loops as being part of that collaborative infrastructure, they might be more engaged in getting together and discussing that data. The idea of having a rigid or fluid program model, it's great to get data that your program doesn't work, but if you can't change the program in the middle or add to it or really make some fixes, it's more discouraging than anything else. We really have to have a bit of a fluid model for this data engagement to be useful to stakeholders. There's also the idea of having openness of organizations to share their faults as well as their strong points. And the same for leads. So having a lead that is very willing to discuss their barriers as well as the things that are going well is important in terms of getting a sense of whether the stakeholders are ready to dig into data with you. I think another thing that I've definitely learned in practice is understanding that we have to make sure that there's a way for the stakeholders to engage with the data that at least makes room for them to change their ideas or shift their perspectives. If the new information is so counter to what they know from other data sources, from their own experience, it's not going to work. We've definitely found that in particular with the idea that, we're doing well with Hispanic women. Our Hispanic women in computing are doing so well, and we have a lot of women in computing and they're all Hispanic. I don't know, you're showing me these numbers and they're not accurate. And what we've found is sometimes faculty are putting their own understanding of Hispanic women and who they might be in a room. And that experience of seeing faces that appear to be Hispanic women and not necessarily from the data perspective of both being maybe residents in terms of NSF, that seems to be a real something that we need to pay attention to. And so really shifting with numbers, information about experience has been something that doesn't always go well. It has to be done maybe multiple times and maybe with a lot of contextual conversation. So I think that there's a lot of different ways to do these data digs, and I'm going to give you some ideas of what I've done in the past. And I'd love to hear your examples, but we can wait for that later, or you can share them as you feel ready to do that. Many of us have heard of this sticky note data walk. There's big posters full of information, and people when we were physically meeting would put little sticky notes with either questions or comments about the information that they were seeing. That's something that's pretty common in the collective impact model, and with collaborative infrastructure, that's something that is used quite often. We've also done it with CAHSI. We've done it virtually, and it's through Miro, which is just another one of those. It's like GatherTown where you're posting information and everybody can see everyone's little cursor, and it's a bit alarming because things move around, but it works out in terms of creating that conversation with data. That's something that we've done in CAHSI with enrollment and graduation data in the departments that we've been working with. In another case, I've brought modules of survey data that was sliced in different ways. And so what stakeholders were able to do were choose the modules that they cared about. So one of the modules was about working students versus students who weren't working. And so it was a lot of differential data around that in the climate that they were perceiving in the department. Another one was feelings of exclusion, and looking really in depth at survey responses that were about feelings of exclusion in the department, and so that they could really develop some new ideas about how to address exclusion. And what was nice about that is people were able to choose where they fit. And we also brought some raw data that we can manipulate. If the module didn't have the right kind of information in it, we were able to, on the fly, kind of come up with some new figures for them to think about this data. And a lot of these examples are coming from the RED grant, which is the Revolutionizing Engineering Departments. So we had a lot of continuous engagement, which I think helped with that. The KWL model, does anyone know that term? Does that sound familiar to anyone that's bringing it up from elementary? It's the what do we know, what do we want to know, and what have we learned? It's very reflective. It's a process of, whiteboarding. What are your current questions? How are we going to help figure that out? What have we learned? And really just creating this data loop with stakeholders. When you have a really fluid evaluation model, and you're allowed that space to be very fluid, that's something that has definitely engaged the constituents that I've worked with, because they say, well, we already have the climate survey data. We don't need more of that. Now we need to understand how students understand their role as a student in our school and how we can support them better. Why don't they go to tutoring? And, all of these questions that faculty have in particular. Another thing that I've done is an artifact review. And this is something that I've done with youth and their own artifacts. And so youth bring something that they've built and they talk through with me the reflection on the engineering design process. So really it's very reflective of the artifact that they've created, and our data revolves around what they've learned about engineering design practice through that. Another thing that I want to try is looking at student transcript data as artifacts. In our work, we see a lot of really interesting student patterns regarding course taking, where they go to community college and then they go to four-year and then they go back to community college and then they retake a class where they already had a B. And there are all these things that are really interesting to me that I wish I understood better and I think could help us understand retention in a new way. And so that's something that I would like to try in an artifact review. I haven't tried it yet. Someone's asking a question about strategies for increasing access to non-English speaking respondents. I think that's a great question. That is not something that I have done very well. I would say that typically when I am working with youth or with students or with adults who are non-English as a first language participants, and it is in a specific culture versus lots of different languages, I've been able to bring in somebody who is fluent in the language. And that is something I think is always important to get the translation, to assume that using multiple languages is important and valuable, and allowing for stakeholders to either find someone who can help translate or create less wordy data to use. Yep, sorry, I see that, Liz. So I think that making sure that those who are engaged can access the material is something that we really have to be thoughtful of. I've done it by making sure that we have at least translation available when we're doing this stuff. I've also seen there's some work out of nonprofit NGOs where there's a lot of illustrative work. There's one paper that I saw where they created almost a cartoon, not a cartoon as in funny, but a cartoon as in a depiction of a cultural event that is happening. And that created a different way into the story. And then that artifact was actually annotated in multiple languages. So that's a way that I think one might do it when you're really looking at cultural ideas or ideas of belonging or retention, to bring up different scenarios. Yeah, Julia. In terms of the idea of primary data collection with a reflective talk with students, what we were able to do is look at the survey data that students had regarding engineering design process, and we were finding they would not necessarily know that they knew it. And so then we would talk about that engineering design process in these artifact reviews with participants. And then we would ask it a different way and get at it in a different way. And so I would say it was a way of us to build on our knowledge and our interpretations of the survey data with the youth involved. I'm not sure that's the best response. I can add to that if that's useful. I see you shaking your head like maybe that's okay for now. So I think what is really important to consider is where you fit. If you're going to be facilitating data analysis or data interpretation or data reflection, it's important to consider, are you an insider? Are you an outsider? And I don't think of those as dichotomous ideas. I think that it's, Hall mentioned that it's multifaceted. Being an insider, being an outsider is multifaceted. My mentor, who as a learning scientist and anthropologist, Susan Giroux, has always reminded me that sometimes our job is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And I know that isn't her quote, but I just always think that someone should tell me who really said that first. But I think it's a really important thing when we're considering insiders and outsiders, because when we are really outside of an organization, we have a lot of opportunity to help revoice what we think the organization is and get some feedback from others about whether or not we're right, and doing so authentically, right? So I'm noticing that this is a practice in your community. Does that sound right to you? I'm kind of new, or this isn't something that I've seen much of yet, and so I'd really like to delve into this. Coming at it from that perspective as an outsider can give stakeholders a lot more opportunity to be explicit about who they are and what they do. I think the benefit of being an insider, as I mentioned, I've been a part of CAHSI, an external evaluator, for since 2007, so however many years that is, 14 years. And that has a lot of benefits. I know a lot about the context of all of the schools that I'm working with. When I had that big data issue, I knew I could email Ileana immediately and say, what's going on? Why are your numbers so weird? On the other side, right, sometimes you can't see what's so close to you. And so sometimes it's nice to have a different voice or a different view on the data to help broaden the perspective of what's going on with data. And so having both insider and outsider, flexing both of those stances, I think can be valuable when you're looking at data with others. I find it's really important to reflect on positionality in terms of who I am, in terms of being a white woman, a social scientist in a room full of scientists or computer scientists or engineers, and also the time of the group. Really reflecting on those before I set out to do a big data dig or a data dive with others, to figure out who I am in this group and how that really might influence how I'm heard or whether I'm heard. So I think that that's something with critical conversations, where when you have a new set of stakeholders, you can find those genuine questions. When you have an old set of stakeholders, you can bring with you that context. And in all cases, it's really important to be reflective about who you are and how you might be perceived by others in the group. Remember that idea of power and evaluation, right? How can we bring down that level of power and really share it with the people that we're engaged with? So 3 things that I've found useful to consider when creating space for critical conversations are knowing my audience epistemologically. How do they make meaning? What's going to be influential to them? And I'm going to talk about things when I haven't done it right, because I think that's a better learning than when I've done it right. I've definitely brought lots of stories to a room full of people who wanted numbers. And it was like, great quote. I'm glad the student was happy. How many students graduated last semester? So being ready for the conversation that others are expecting, while making room for the other, right? And so in future, I was able to produce all the numbers about who is graduating and what we needed to think about in terms of retention and recruitment and tell stories, right? So that everyone was able to broaden their perspective on the data, but also that I was acknowledging what kind of information that they were most likely to hone in on. I think it's also important to think about protecting data. And I mean this in a lot of ways. Protecting data around whether or not if you're going to share data that's going to be really recognizable to stakeholders, something obviously we want to avoid. But also protecting others' ideas about when it's okay and with whom it's okay to share data about them or about their department or about their efforts. And so we've had a lot of shift with includes from being very much a evaluation collects all the numbers, we spit out the data to you all, to little regions getting used to sharing their own numbers with each other so that they feel more comfortable in the smaller group and then sharing that data more nationally across all of the stakeholders. And we found that that was a slow process. We had to really be thoughtful about how people were feeling about their own numbers and about how they might describe their context in such a way that it would help understand the numbers that they were seeing. We know that there aren't a lot of women in computer science, right? So nobody had great computer science numbers, but kind of putting that in context of the national scope was helpful for people to feel more comfortable sharing, saying, well, I have 15% women, but that's not too far off of the average and the national average. And so that they have a little more context to feel okay with their own numbers and to share with the idea that we're all trying to make the numbers better, not deride one another for what we have right now. So I think that's important to think about both protecting the data that you share and making sure that people are trusting enough to share their own data in an open forum with others in your group. And another thing is this scaffolding that is needed and what context is needed for stakeholders to really dig into data. I've definitely been in a room where there's charts that we're supposed to be digging in on and nobody understands the charts. And so nobody has anything to say. And so we have to take a lot of time to build through what the charts might mean, just what the axes are and what the colors are, not necessarily how to make sense of them, but just making sure that the materials we're presenting are things that lots of different kinds of people can make sense of is part of that scaffolding. But another part of that scaffolding is just really like providing guiding questions. What do you notice? What do you think is interesting about the orange number? And really making sure that there's a conversation that you're starting and not just popping up data and saying, what do you think, right? That's kind of need to guide some of those conversations. I've definitely been in a room where when I've been the one to put up data and everyone just looks at me blankly and I have to, okay, sorry, let me step back. This is what this is all about. Now I'm going to give you 7 minutes to look at it. Okay, now what do you notice, right? You kind of have to back up and make sure that everybody's on the same page. And that's something that we all are learning from practice, I think. Okay, we are almost early, which is crazy. I am going to put a handout in the chat. And here is what I propose we do. And I know that when you all get in your small groups, you will do whatever you choose to do, and I am very okay with that. But I'm going to give you this, something I call a cognitive structure. It's something that's going to help you think about these ideas, hopefully in productive ways. And we are going to have, do people see the handout? I see a nod, okay. Here's what I suggest we try. First, I'm going to have you look at the handout, get a sense of it, see how it fits who you are, and see how you might start answering it. We are going to keep our videos off until we feel ready to talk, even if you're in your small group, okay? And then when you get to your group, we are going to have the person who lives furthest from Washington, D.C., because I don't know, be the facilitator. So you're just going to kind of keep the conversation going. If you are the person who lives closest to DC, you will be the reporter when we get back together, okay? And then we don't have a ton of time, but we're also a really small group. So I think if you want to introduce yourselves and spend some time getting to know each other, that is totally fine. Let's do that because we have enough time to do that. But also try to be thoughtful in saying, hi, this is Sarah. I think this. It'll help us with our note taking. You have a handout in here. I think, Pradipti, shall we break them up?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm gonna open the rooms now.
Okay, I'm gonna float around, and then you have a little bit of a structure to talk, and I will jump in and say, what do you need? And we are gonna meet back up at 5 after the hour, whatever hour that is where you are. Okay, so you have a bit of time in your groups. Is that cool? So we had a very short time period, so I don't imagine that you've solved all of these problems. But I thought it would be helpful to just start by talking about what you discovered and what you're curious about regarding creating critical conversations. And I believe our reporters who are closest to DC are the ones who are going to start us off. Do you all know who you are?
Yes.
Yes, cool. Go for it.
All right, I'll start us off then. So, our discussion, we really only got as far as position / positionality, but that said, we talked about, the purpose of, sharing data being to give us perspective on what's important and meaningful and help us inform what we do moving forward. In terms of needs, we spent a bit more time on that. Some of the big things were, how do you prime your audience to be ready to receive your data? Because sometimes they don't, it's really just not within their a way of, thinking about things at this point, and finding time, that their time, really more than your time, our time, to get them to engage with it is often a challenge. And there's the different levels of stakeholders within the project, and sometimes certain, the higher levels, for example, might be easier to engage with than at the leadership level, might be easier to engage with than the people that are on the ground actually running things and such. And there's always the problem that when you're engaging with just a few people, that your perspective on the whole project is filtered through those people's way of looking at it, and that you're missing a great deal of the picture. And then when we talked about positionality, and we came upon the question of how does one measure certain types of things that maybe aren't within the traditional way of looking at a problem. And the example that we gave was the reasons for why young women and minority students are not engaging with computing or engineering or some of these things. And we talked a bit about how we can come into that perspective differently than, into that position differently than maybe someone else would from a different perspective, and use more qualitative types of measures to really understand the story beyond, simply, measures of interest and things like that. And if anyone else from my group wants to add to that, feel absolutely free.
Thank you. Anyone from group I believe you were group 3. Can anyone from group 1 or 2 want to share something that they're curious about moving forward or something that they want to try? Or that their group wants to try?
I suppose I can pop in here for a second. One of the things that we talked about was making sure that you have the time to analyze and talk about the data. If you're having a really big data pool, but no one's ever going to look at it, is that really an effective use of your time? Being realistic about how much time it's going to take to analyze something like transcriptional data. And then when you have your results, give it to someone who's really passionate about it. If you know that someone on your team is all about dogs and they want to talk about, you know, you have data that comes along your desk that is about dogs, give it to that person, for example, because you can't replicate, you can't fake authentic, you know, excitement about a topic. And it really helps your audience to engage if you yourself are excited about the data. Kellyanne, do you have something else you might want to add?
We were just trying to brainstorm how to take that engagement and like, what does that really mean for the person facilitating it, and talked about just, you know, on a real gritty level, like maybe setting up the room as a circle instead of that sort of classic podium look. So you kind of just subtly acknowledge that it is okay to challenge the conclusions that the facilitator has drawn, and it's okay to just voice a different opinion and really try to be more open to what the data is saying. So I think that's really important. We also thought about how long it takes and how much time that takes. So I think that really, for me, makes me think about like how could we cut down on the data that we're collecting and just focus on what we really care about.
Yeah, how that scope can really can help go deeper, not wider, right, in that data. Anything really quick from I believe group 2?
Yeah, I'll just quickly talk about oh, sorry, I got some feedback there. I'll just quickly talk about what we talked about under position and positionality. We talked about the importance of moving between spaces and recognizing how your stakeholders view you and your expertise, and the importance of bringing different perspectives to the table and how that affects data collection, and really emphasize the importance of bringing student voice in on data collection. And then I think another interesting thing we talked about is how evaluators are many times viewed as extensions of the leadership of a project, and trying to get stakeholders to understand how we differ a little bit from leadership, and how the confidentiality of what they share with us will be protected, and how it'll be reported, and helping them to understand that.
Thank you all so much for being such thoughtful participants and sharing with each other. I really appreciate it. I'm always willing to talk about this sort of thing. My email is give me a hug at colorado.edu. If this is something that you're interested in, maybe we can bring it into the Includes network a little bit. Maybe we can ask for one of the evaluation group sessions or one of the shared measures sessions to continue our conversation. I can share my slides. I'm not sure. I know the portal is a way to do that, and I don't know what that looks like. So if you want them and I don't get them to you, just email me and I can send them your way. And the resources I use for this. And I really appreciate your participation. Thank you, everyone.